I'm Anne, co-host of Transparency in Teaching, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hey, welcome back. Steve here, and today I'm talking with Janine Walker-Caffrey, and she is the Chief Academic Officer at EPS Learning. Our focus is on providing effective reading instruction. Oh, so much to learn. Awesome conversation. Oh, by the way, before you go, it'd be so cool if you took time to help out the podcast. How could you do that, you ask? Glad you asked that question. Well, here are 3 ways. 1, you could tell a friend and share links. 2, you could go to my website and leave a review and subscribe. And 3, how about this? Click on the link on my website homepage where it says Buy Me a Coffee. And by doing this, you could donate $1 or $2 to help me address the costs, associated with producing the podcast. That'd be so cool. You are awesome. Enjoy the show.
Because that's been our history for as long as we've actually been tracking these sorts of things. For over 30, maybe 40 years now, we have known that only about a third of our kids are proficient readers. We have known for all of this time that we are woefully lagging behind other industrialized nations in teaching children to read.
It's the Education Podcast, your favorite show, with lots of groovy guests and they share what they know. So crank it up to 10 and let your neighbors know that here's another show with Dr. Steve Milletto. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12. With Dr. Steve Milletto.
Janine Walker-Caffrey, the Chief Academic Officer at EPS Learning, is a career educator who has been a teacher, special education, English as a second language, physics, school founder, principal, and superintendent. She is also the author of 2 parenting books inspired by her own 2 children. We got a lot to talk about today. Janine, thanks so much for being on the show, and say hi to everyone.
Hi, great to be here, Steve.
We're glad to have you, and let's start by talking about you. Your career has been focused on the education of children. What do you like best about working with and for kids and their families?
Well, I really like the ability to help kids be the best people they can be. And for me, it's been focused mostly around teaching children to read. That has been the focus of my career since the very beginning, way back in the 80s. Watching a student go from a striving reader to someone who feels comfortable with text is just the most exciting thing I can imagine in a career.
Oh, that's awesome. It is neat to see them. First of all, the light bulbs go on, and ideas,
Yep.
and the growth and being able to do different things. Love it. I like it. It's cool. Good stuff. All right, so let's shift gears and let's talk about EPS Learning. So, what's its purpose? I mean, how does it achieve that purpose?
EPS is on a mission to make literacy the springboard to lifelong success. And so we are solely focused on helping kids become stronger readers and better learners.
Excellent. So, all right. So you're the Chief Academic Officer for EPS Learning. What do you do?
Great question. My team is responsible for several things. We are responsible for all of the content that goes into our print and digital programs. And we are responsible for testing the efficacy of all of our programs. So we engage in quite a bit of research at schools. We are also responsible for supporting our sales teams in bids and contracts. So that means we create the responses to requests for proposals for school districts and states.
Very nice. So there seems to be, let's shift into reading a little bit here. There seems to be a large discussion about what works best to help kids learn to read. I mean, what do you think so? I mean, it's like become a thing all of a sudden. It's like, dun, dun, dun. Everybody's going to be talking about reading.
Well, I would say that it's been a thing for a long time for those of us in the education space. It's been a thing for so long that many people have just kind of thrown their hands up and given up. Like, only a third of kids are going to learn how to read. Because that's been our history for as long as we've actually been tracking these sorts of things. For over 30, maybe 40 years now, we have known that only about a third of our kids are proficient readers. We have known for all of this time that we are woefully lagging behind other industrialized nations in teaching children to read. And despite our best efforts, things have not really gotten much better. You'll hear people say that it's gotten a whole lot worse since the pandemic. And that's true, but we're talking about 4 percentage points. That's it. And so we got better with just a few kids. We never really did this well. A few things happened since the pandemic. First of all, as a result of the pandemic, parents were seeing up close and personal what the reading classroom looked like, because they were sitting right next to their children during Zoom lessons. So they were seeing this. I don't understand this. This is strange. So that happened. And then the data dropped even further than it had. So the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, we were also referred to as our nation's report card, dropped several points after the pandemic. So a brand new spotlight was like, wow, we thought we were making some gains. They were small, but we thought we were making some gains, and now we've lost all the gains we've made. So that happened. And then we also had a lot of media attention, mainly through the podcast Sold a Story by APM, American Public Media, Emily Hanford's pieces that shone a spotlight on this in a new way, told the stories of kids and teachers and parents and how they were struggling with this issue. So that got a lot of people to understand it better. And finally, and probably most importantly, parents in great numbers across the country in advocacy groups like Decoding Dyslexia and International Dyslexia Association became very active in shifting legislation and helping to set up a framework that would allow schools to make the changes they need to make. So all those things kind of coalesced over the last few years, and now we're finally seeing the country mobilizing around finding a solution to this problem. And by the way, this is an extremely solvable problem. We already know how to solve the problem. We just need the will to do it.
Awesome. It's something that, as a kid, I had parents who they read, and they read to me, and they made sure I had books. And I think every relative under the sun gave me a book at some point or another.
Right.
And they included me in conversations at the dinner table, and we had dinner table conversations, and we had, I got sung to in the bathtub and stuff like this, stuff that I continued on, and it's with my own children. And it's interesting that I think that, one of the things that comes out of all of this is the importance of structures that the family can provide. I mean, any thoughts about that?
I do think that helps. And I come from a family of readers as well, so I completely understand that. My own 2 children really didn't struggle at all with reading. They almost, were born to read, if you will. But imagine if you had a child that it didn't come easily for. And this is why so many parents became mobilized. Imagine you had a family of readers who valued that, who had those structures the way that you just described them. And then all of a sudden, a kid is born into that family. And the one kid, you might have 3 or 4 kids, but the one kid, for some reason, can't quite do it. And that's been the case for a lot of families. So they've struggled to understand, well, why can't my kid do it? In some cases, it's because the child has dyslexia, has a real learning difference. In other cases, though, there wasn't any real learning difference, but still the child struggled. So parents were trying to figure out what had caused that. And it turned out that a lot of what was happening that was preventing children from learning to read was the fact that we weren't teaching them properly. We weren't teaching them in a way that the research tells us is how we should be teaching them. And so we have now a couple of generations of children who have gone through the American school system who have not learned to read in a way that is consistent with how research tells us it should be done.
Gotcha. All right. So what do you think schools need to be doing differently, to provide that reading instruction then? So if, we've got different sorts of type of narrative that's happening here with how the kids need to learn how to read. We may not have been doing it right. What do they need to be doing?
Well, the National Panel on Reading that was Gates report in the year 2000 really laid us a nice kind of roadmap for how this should work. And a lot of research has been done since then that has augmented it. But it's important to look at that first structure. So we look at 5 basic pillars of reading: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And if we make sure that we're providing those 5 pillars of reading, instruction in those 5 pillars of reading in the way that makes the most sense for where each child is in their development, then we do pretty well. But if we forget about one or more of those pillars, then we have problems. So phonemic awareness is understanding understanding the differences between sounds and the ability to manipulate those sounds, things like rhyming words, substituting one sound for another, those kinds of things. And then we have phonics, and phonics is making that connection between the letters and the sounds. Fluency is being able to read kind of smoothly with a decent enough pace so you can understand what you're reading. And then vocabulary, of course, the words that you need, having a good understanding of the language so that you can attach meaning to words. And then comprehension is pulling everything together. And you need a balance. You'll hear people talk about balanced literacy. And the thing that we got right in balanced literacy is we understood what we refer to as the simple view of reading, which means decoding multiplied by language understanding equals comprehension. If you don't have the decoding skills, you really can't understand what you're reading. And if you don't have the language skills, you really can't understand what you're reading. So the idea of balanced literacy many years ago was to make sure you were attending to both of those things. Unfortunately, over the years, balanced literacy became a bit unbalanced, and they kind of forgot the decoding part. It would happen as in happenstance that the focus was all on either independent reading or guided reading groups focusing on comprehension. And then if there were decoding pieces that the kid needed as they were reading, the teacher would kind of insert them. But there was no intentionality, no systematic approach in teaching the very specific decoding skills that children would need in order to break down the words. One of the things that came out of balanced literacy was an approach that would have kids do everything else first before they would actually go left to right in the word and figure out what those letters meant. And you'll hear people saying things like, oh, well, the English language is the most confusing language in the world. Not true. There are some languages that are easier to understand and easier to learn to read, and some languages that are harder to learn to read. So that's not true. And you'll hear people say it's completely unpredictable. Also not true. Yes, there are exceptions to things because the English language is a language built on many other languages. And so the etymology of a word may determine a particular spelling pattern. For example, the EAU pattern in beautiful comes from French. And so if you don't understand that, you may have to memorize that little spelling pattern. But for the most part, generally over 90% of what you see in each word, they're very predictable patterns. And so if you teach kids the main patterns that they're going to see, they're going to be able to decode almost every word when they approach it, whether or not they've ever seen or heard that word before. And so we want to make sure that early on, from pre-K through about beginning of grade 2, that we are giving every student a full education, a systematic, explicit understanding of the spelling patterns that they need to understand in order to decode and spell words. And unfortunately, that is not happening in many schools in our country. Instead, we are teaching children the go-to strategy is to look at the picture and look at the first letter of the word and what do you think it might mean? Instead of saying, okay, what's the first letter in that word? What sound does that letter make? What's the second letter in that word? What sound does that make? And so we have to attend to that first. Now, while we're doing that, while we are really focusing on those decoding skills in those early grades, we don't want to forget about the vocabulary and comprehension piece. We want to make sure we're still developing those language skills that are necessary in order for the child to make meaning of the text. And so while they're learning to decode, we want to be engaging in just an infinite amount of oral language activities. So reading aloud to students, engaging in conversation to students, finding ways throughout the school day for them to build their background knowledge, for them to build their vocabulary, for them to build their understanding of the world in social studies and science and art and music and all of those other things. Our knee-jerk reaction over the years has been, well, if they don't know how to read, then we need to give them more reading. And so what you'll see in many schools today is 2-hour literacy blocks to the expense of science and social studies. So they're not getting the content they need to build their language skills because we're too focused on reading comprehension. But during that literacy block, we're not giving them the decoding skills they need to understand the written word. So it's a long way of saying we have spent too much time on reading comprehension, not enough time on decoding, to the expense of the background knowledge building and content that children also need in order to become good readers.
Appreciate you sharing that. That's it makes it very understandable what's going on, because we kind of go through cycles. This is my 38th year in public education in the state of Georgia now, and it's, you see cycles over time nationally that what gets focused on, what doesn't, and we seem to be zeroing in on a big part of what matters here, as opposed to just
right.
Someone wrote a book. and it became
I hope we're starting to get it right. I think we are.
Good stuff. All right, so one of the things, you can't go through our world right now without in some way, shape, or form, you're going to read an article that says something about AI. So let's talk about what potential you see AI and emergent technologies helping support struggling readers. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah, I think AI can play a big role in that, and we are already uncovering wonderful uses of AI. We have a program called Reading Assistant at EPS Learning that does exactly what I'll tell you. The promise of AI is the personalization of learning for each individual student that allows them to get the support they need exactly when they need it. It's like having a tutor sitting with a child who's reading aloud all the time. So, for example, in our Reading Assistant program, the child reads a passage, and if the child is struggling with a particular word, the AI, it's an avatar tutor, will jump in and say, it looks like you're having trouble with that word, and will help them sound out the word using those decoding skills. If the child has already mastered most of their decoding skills, it may be that they are struggling because they don't have the vocabulary, that there's a vocabulary word in that passage that they need help with. And so in that case, the AI tutor would support that child with maybe an image and a description of what the word is. If the child has pretty decent vocabulary and it looks like it's just an overall comprehension issue, the AI tutor might have a comprehension conversation with the child. And so it says, wow, it sounds like you really understand this text. It might ask the child a question, the child responds. And when you hear them having this conversation, it's as if it was a parent talking to a child about a book they just read. And so every day, the child has access to what we would refer to as mediated text, to someone responding to them in real time about the text to help them grow their reading skills. While it would be great if they had a parent or a teacher by their side every day to do that, we know that that's likely not happening in many cases. And so we want every child to have access to somebody to help them make sense of text in a way that will grow their reading skills. So AI, in terms of reading instruction, provides that personalization, real-time mediation and intervention to grow their reading skills in such volume that every child is ensured consistent access to that kind of support. Beyond that, the data that it is collecting along the way will give teachers the real-time information they need to plan their next direct instruction, their next explicit instruction activities. So I can tell by looking at my dashboard that a particular child, maybe I have 5 kids in my room who all need work on the long A sound. And so then I can pull a group together and work specifically on the thing that they're all struggling with. Teachers get the information to plan instruction. Teachers get the information in an aggregate way to see if their class is growing. Principals and school leaders can see if schools are growing and what they need to work on in larger terms. But most importantly, every child, every day has access to feedback and intervention that will help them grow as readers.
Excellent. Appreciate it. From AI, let's talk about something else. Our society over the years has developed now the research and the understanding, and so there's more of a focus on how to address something that many students and children and adults have to deal with, which is called dyslexia. What would you say is the biggest challenge schools face in supporting students with this dyslexia?
The first challenge that schools have is to understand who really has dyslexia, because we have, over the past, I'd say 5 years or so, started to lump everybody together in one group and calling them dyslexic. So no matter what the cause of your reading struggle, we think that they have dyslexia. That's not true. The truth is we don't really know exactly how many students have dyslexia, because generally speaking, we don't go all the way through a diagnostic process to understand that. The screening tools that we use will generally report on the risk of dyslexia. Based on these results, it's X percent that this child may have dyslexia is the kind of language that you'll see, because they're not complete diagnostic tools. Dyslexia is really a neurological difference in how language is processed. And for people who have dyslexia, it's a real struggle that takes a lot of time and intensive intervention in order to move forward and to become good readers. Absolutely can happen, and absolutely does happen with the right interventions. However, the great majority of the students who we may think of as having dyslexia, let's say you are in a school system that has 80%, 90% of children who require reading intervention, that's not because they all have dyslexia. It's because you're not teaching them properly. I have a friend who calls it dysteachia. And a lot of people call it that. So you need to look first, do I have a dyslexia problem at my school, or do I have a dysteachia problem at my school? And I would say that if you have, let's say, state test results that are anything lower than probably 85% proficiency, more than likely you've got some type of dysteachia problem happening at your school. We need to first look at what are we doing in our early grades to help kids become strong readers. If it's not aligned with the science of reading, if it doesn't include explicit, systematic, cumulative instruction and phonemic awareness and phonics as the foundation, if that's not present, then we probably need to attend to that. If we look at our 6th graders as an example, and we do an oral reading fluency assessment on those students, and they have somewhere they're performing under 75 words correct per minute, and the majority of them are there, I can almost guarantee you that in 1st grade and 2nd grade, you're not teaching phonics properly. So we have that's the biggest issue right now, is to really understand what is dyslexia truly and what is a problem based on our tier 1 or mainstream education instruction.
That is so powerful to understand and to recognize it. It's interesting. The first time I ran into dysteachia as a word, I was reading this article and I ran across this word. I'm like, I wonder how you say, and I was like, oh, I get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was just funny. It's like I had not seen that written before.
Yeah.
But it is a brilliant observation of what some of the difficulty is, and it's so important that we recognize that and the differences. So let's talk a little bit about, what's one small step educators can do today to help their students struggle productively in the classroom? I mean, while working towards getting better at grade level, achieving grade level literacy. What do you think? What's something that a classroom teacher can do to help their kids, grow in the right direction?
Well, I love the way that you just framed that in struggle productively. I think that's what you said, right?
Yes, that's what I said.
That is an idea that is overlooked in a lot of education circles, because the generation we're raising today in our schools and in our homes are kids that, everyone gets a trophy. You're always a winner. It's a very positive culture that we have, which is great. We want kids to feel good about themselves. We also want them to understand that we learn through making mistakes, and we learn through that productive struggle. So making sure that growth mindset idea is present in our classrooms, I think is the important piece of what you just said. In terms of reading instruction, we want to make sure that students have access to texts that are beyond their reading level. We've spent a long time talking about the just right reading level for students, and the research doesn't back that up completely. Turns out that if there's a big gap between what they can do and what you put in front of them, it's the gap that causes the growth in reading. But you can't just hand a kid with a fourth grade reading level a high school text and expect them to be able to make sense out of it. What you can do is to understand what motivates a child to want to read, what excites them, what do they want to learn about. So the one thing I think it's really important for teachers to do that is often overlooked in this age of standards and state tests and all of the things that we deal with in public education is, what do you want to learn about? What's exciting to you? And finding those teachable moments and finding those little sparks that would ignite a child to want to read something. I have seen countless children over the years, including my own two children, become excited about reading because they were excited about the subject that they were reading about. And I've told the story a million times about my own son, who the summer between first and second grade found The Hobbit, an illustrated, big, thick edition of The Hobbit on the shelves. That was my husband's. And he was looking through the book at these beautiful illustrations, and he brought it to me first day of summer. He said, "Mom, I'm going to read this book this summer." And I didn't say, "Oh, no, Daniel, that's too hard. You can't read." I never said that to him. I said, "Okay, great." That child read that book that summer. And he didn't have the skills to do that. Not far from it, but he would look at each page and he would find one or two words that he could make sense out of. And because my husband loved that book, he would sit down with them and they would take turns reading. And by the end of the summer, he absolutely was able to read that book fluently because he spent hours on it every day because he was so excited about the content. I had a student one time who loved cars. And everybody had tried to engage this kid in reading, the typical things like we sell at EPS Learning that may or may not be exciting. And so finally I said, I'm going to forget all these like commercially produced texts. I'm just going to find books about cars. This kid just wants to read about cars. I'm going to give him books about cars. And he learned to read because he wanted to know about the cars. I think that excitement about what's the content in the text, you can find examples of that from kindergarten all the way through high school. If it's something that's important to the child, if it's something that excites them and makes them want to learn, that they want to learn about, they will figure out a way to read about it. So find those texts that contain the content that the child is excited about, provide that mediated support so they can begin reading about it, give them lots of opportunities and lots of support, and that will take them miles and miles.
That's awesome. And by the way, I had to, I too somewhere in there discovered The Hobbit.
Oh, did you?
Yes, and it was one of my favorite books. And what's funny though is that I tried very hard as a kid because I ran into friends because my reading went other directions, and but I really liked that. And then when I was a kid, there's a animation studio called Rankin Bass that produced. I'm pretty sure they produced The Hobbit,
of course,
and they and that made it also come alive, and so that made me read it over again and stuff like this. And so then I took on Lord of the Rings and got to the
Perfect.
woods and finally said, hey, I don't know where this is going.
Right.
And,
Right.
it's funny, as an adult, I went back to it to try and read again because I've got a son who's got different volumes. He's got different not versions, but all different production versions of it and stuff like this. And he reads it all the time. And I still get stuck in the woods. Once you get to the trees, I'm like, but and I'm an avid reader and stuff like this. But it's interesting what you were talking about because I do understand that concept of as a challenge, and the interest has to go, really has to go with it because
That's right.
It's a fascinating aspect of that. But I had to tell you that's The Hobbit was one of those things that these guys are great. Got to go to New Zealand and see those sets someday. But anyway.
And of course, the more recent phenomenon is the Harry Potter series.
Yes.
If you look back at the early 2000s, if you were a third or fourth grader, it was a rite of passage to read The Hobbit. At that time, I had a librarian in the school where I was working who was denying my students access to Harry Potter. And because they were special ed students with very limited reading abilities at the time. And the librarian actually sent my students, made them take their books back to the shelves because she told them they couldn't read well enough to read Harry Potter. And I went and took all the books out for them. I had a student that year who was reading on maybe beginning first grade level, and he would read 1 page a day of Harry Potter, and it was the most exciting part of his day. And by the end of the year, he read Harry Potter, and that was what caused him to learn to read. So that productive struggle, because he was motivated by something that was so exciting to him, caused him to be able to read.
That's awesome. I have to say, so when my oldest son was, I forget what age, but he was getting in there, and and he was a reader. He was a reader at a very early age, and my mother-in-law she said, I heard about all these books, this book that's coming out that everybody's all excited about, so I want to buy them for my grandson. And my wife and I said, well, there's all these adults excited about it, so let me read it first before to make sure that it's truly a kid's book, not necessarily that the adults are, anyway, hopefully you get my point.
Yep.
And,
Exactly.
I got hooked on them and I read them all, as they came out and all that stuff, and passed them on to him. And the only thing is, he wouldn't have discussions with me about it. I'm like, dadgummit.
Oh, no.
No, that was not cool.
You were robbed.
Yes, I was robbed, dadgummit. But it is amazing because having lived through that also, to see that the impact that it had on a generation of children as they got older and so forth, and they're reading and wanting to read more, and then what it did to the book industry, just the impact of it there. So just something else. It's but I have to make sure that I say this because something that you said, the interest of the reader is so important there as well. I worked with a young man who was struggling. I was in college, and you could get paid if you wanted to help kids learn to read. And there was a department at the university where you went, and they worked with you on some things. And he was a teenager. He was somewhere in early teens type thing. And he really didn't read much. His mom was trying to get him some help. And it was interesting because trying to figure out what he wanted to read. And he thought about, this was a new thing then, but he thought about Star Wars and stuff like this. And,
right.
And what it turned out, what he really liked was he was learning to play the guitar, and he was a fan of certain guitarists and bass players and stuff like this. And he read these, well, he didn't really read these magazines, but he looked at these magazines and stuff like this, and that's what he really wanted to read. And you're just reminding me of those discussions as we decided to, take a look at finding something about those guitarists and the stuff that they had written and things like this. And it was amazing how much more someone then wants to move forward and try to get through those things that are difficult. They're written at a lot higher level than some other books or things.
Reading shouldn't be a chore. If you want to raise people who love to read, they have to love what they're reading. Otherwise, what's the point?
Right, exactly. It's so important, so important. All right, so Let's shift gears here just a little bit. I mean, due to economic and staffing limitations, interventions currently only serve about half of students with a reading difficulty, and now with ESSER funding sunsetting, that's only going to be increasingly difficult. What is EPS doing to support schools in this landscape?
That's such a great question. We work with a lot of school districts that are in exactly the situation that you just described. And we have districts with 83, 87% students who need intervention, some over 90% need intervention, some have interventionists, some don't. And what we're doing with those districts is partnering with district leadership to figure out what's the best way to provide the intervention to every single child who needs it. So if you have, let's say, a middle school, and over 80% of the students in that middle school require intervention, going back to an earlier point, that's a tier 1 problem. That means intervention really needs to be provided in every ELA classroom in that middle school. You can't just pick and choose, of these 700 kids, I think I'll just intervene with 300. Well, who are the 400 you don't want to become good readers? How do you make that kind of decision? And unfortunately, there have been many cases that I have seen of school district and school building leadership in which they will choose the kids they call the bubble kids. And the bubble kids are the ones who are almost passing the state test. And so they'll prioritize the students who will make the statistics of the school look better. When the truth is, the kids who need it the most, the students who are really low, they'll actually make the most growth. But you may not get them all the way to the point that they'll pass the state test that year. So school leaders and district leaders sometimes will make decisions based on that. Thankfully, we're starting to move away from that. But the reality is many, let's pick an urban middle school with 90% free and reduced lunch, and over 80% students need reading intervention based on their state test scores. Okay. And I have no reading interventionist. I don't have anybody extra in my school to teach anything. I don't have any extra classrooms to pull small groups. I am a crowded urban school where almost all of the students are reportedly in need of reading intervention, and I have nobody to provide it, no space to provide it, and no time to provide it. And so what we're doing in those types of districts is we're working with the district leaders and saying, okay, let's take a look at your schedule. Do you have an extended homeroom where you do advisory? Do you have what some people refer to as a win period, what I need, where you're doing those types of things built into the day? Do you have time before the bell rings in the morning, after the bell rings in the afternoon? Is your lunch long enough where you could carve out 20 minutes? And so we help them find the time first. Or because those numbers are so high, should this be part of your ELA class for every child so that your ELA teachers can deliver it? So what we've done is we've created a program called Reading Accelerator that does exactly that, that will allow intervention to happen at the whole class level for classrooms where the great majority of students are in need of intervention. And you'll see 6th graders, 7th graders, even 8th graders working on phonics. The pushback we always get is, well, won't children feel singled out? Won't they be embarrassed? And the answer is no. I have never seen children embarrassed by this. We'll also hear, well, don't kids get bored? Phonics is boring. It's not true. If you're the child who doesn't know phonics, and this kind of unlocks the door to being able to read, you don't find it boring at all. You find it very exciting. I walk through classrooms where we're using this approach, and I see engaged, excited children learning how to read for the first time, even though they're in middle school. I see teachers who are now confident in their ability to reach children. And what we have seen across the board is reductions in absenteeism, improvements in behavior, because students are now getting what they need. So at EPS Learning, we are very committed to partnering with districts to make intervention accessible to every student who needs it. And we will be side by side with district leaders in order to find time in their schedules, approaches that will allow whole classes to get the intervention that's needed, and support and training for the teachers and sometimes paraprofessionals who are doing the work. This is, as I said, it is a solvable problem. And so we are addressing it as such, bringing optimism and partnership to districts who are ready to do what is needed to be done.
Awesome. Love it. So how do schools engage with EPS Learning? I mean, and what's that look like?
Schools will come to us sometimes through a sales representative. They might meet somebody at a conference. Sometimes they'll email me. Sometimes they'll talk to our professional learning community. We're very, very accessible and happy to talk with them anytime about what they need. There are some schools that simply buy some workbooks each year for a particular program. There are other schools, some of the large urban districts that I've described here, where we are full partners helping them with scheduling and professional development of teachers and cultural change across their district and implementing specific programs for specific needs. So it's any range of what the school needs. If they just need some products to help them with a particular issue, great, we have that. But if they really want a full partner who's going to help transform their district, we would love to be engaged with them.
Awesome. So right with that question goes this. So where can our listeners find additional information, connect and learn more, and go about engaging with EPS Learning?
Sure. They can go to epslearning.com and see lots of information about our programs. I'm also happy to chat with people on LinkedIn. You can find me there. And EPS Learning has a LinkedIn channel as well, LinkedIn page as well. So we are happy to engage with you whenever and wherever makes sense for you. We'll meet you where you are.
Awesome. And I'll put that information in the show notes so it's easy for them to link to you and connect. So good stuff. Last question for you, Janine, and it goes like this. Do you have a teacher in your past who made a difference in your life? If so, if given the chance to say thank you, who is it and what would you say?
Yeah, I have a wonderful teacher in high school named Barbara Newman. Barbara, I went to high school a really long time ago, so Barbara is no longer with us. She was probably in her 60s when I was her student, and I did have the opportunity right after college to go back and thank her, and I'm glad that I did. She taught me Latin and English. Barbara is the person who really ignited in me a love of reading and a love of language. I always tell people that I learned grammar through learning Latin. And what I loved about Barbara is that she was very tough. She had the highest expectations and complete belief in all of her students' ability to meet those expectations. So that's what I really loved about her.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Janine, thank you so much for talking with us about helping children read, literacy solutions, and EPS learning. Awesome focus. Wishing you the best in all you do.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Hey, you have been listening to Teaching Learning Leading K12, a podcast to help you help kids achieve their dreams. Teaching Learning Leading K12 is a member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. Teaching Learning Leading K12 is a member of the podcast network based in Canada called Voice Ed Radio. Voice Ed Radio, your voice is right here. The opinions expressed on Teaching Learning Leading K12 are those of the guests and host. Teaching Learning Leading K12 is intended to share ideas, advice, and suggestions. Teaching Learning Leading K12 is produced for educational purposes. Hey, thanks for listening. It would be awesome if you visited my website at stephenmiletto.com and connected with me, left a review, and listened to more episodes. And by the way, you could also share it with your friends, with your family, and your colleagues. Thanks so much. You're awesome.